Good evening, everybody. I'm Barbara Corcoran, Vice President for Continuing Education at the New York Botanical Garden, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 20th Annual Landscape Design Portfolio Series featuring our speaker, Charles Birnbaum. Anyone who visits public parks or gardens appreciates their beauty, but most people don't stop to think about all the shapes and slopes, the play of light and shadows, the choices of plants and materials, even the benches, all come from creative design decisions made by landscape architects. That's one reason why each fall the New York Botanical Garden provides this showcase for outstanding landscape architects and designers to share their process and discuss the projects that enhance our lives. 2018 is a landmark year for the series, which began in 1998 and is now a signature program in the garden calendar. Tonight we want to celebrate that, but we also want to salute and thank Susan Cohen, give her a big shout out. Susan Cohen founded the portfolios and has curated it since its inception. In Susan's own words, these presentations by landscape architects are a way to broaden the reach of the garden and to further its mission to educate the public, but not only about plants, also about the designs of spaces where both plants and people can thrive. Over the past 2 decades, Susan has brought us influential designers from around the world. Cornelia Oberlander, Kung-Jen Yu, Peter Walker, Kim Wilkie, Laurie Olin, Signe Nielsen, just to name a small handful. The portfolio has become a real tradition at the garden, and I'm so glad that you could all join us tonight as we begin our 20th season. But tonight is also special because it's the first time a series speaker will be introduced by our new CEO and president, Carrie Rabora Barrett. Dr. Barrett came to us in June following a distinguished 34-year career at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she most recently served as deputy director during a transformational period in the museum's history. Throughout her career, she has made it her passion and her business to connect, support, and study nature, culture, and education in our great city. And all those three come together perfectly at NYBG. So we are delighted to have her here this evening. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Rabora Barrett.
Good evening, everybody. Well, this is one of those podiums where you can see me, but I can't see you at all. That's so interesting. But that's good, because I won't be up here for very long, because it's my pleasure to introduce Charles Birnbaum, who I've just met, but who I hope to have many, many conversations with going forward. I think about series like this, which I'm also learning about and beginning to engage, thinking, this is an amazing series, 20 years, thank you so much. 20 years is a very long time, but probably just scratches the surface of what we can learn about cultural landscape, continuity, historic preservation, and all of the great ideas that go beyond something that might look as simple, I don't have to tell you, preaching to the choir, as a beautiful landscape, but actually takes a great deal more than passion and knowledge. And I can't think of anybody better to kick off this 20th anniversary than Charles, who has developed the Cultural Landscape Foundation precisely to, I'm sure, carry on his work as a great landscape designer, but to make sure it means something. I was actually, not part of my notes, but talking to a colleague in science this afternoon, trying to be a little, not provocative, but actually we were like role-playing for some fundraising that we would have to do, and he was telling me about this intricate work in science that we're doing with DNA and resourcing, and I said, but why are we doing that? You know, so why are you doing that? Why are you? And it wasn't that I didn't think it was important. It's that at the end of all of this, it really is about what's core to the garden, and I think core of what you do. It's saving the environment. It's saving the plants of the world. It's recognizing that without them, we wouldn't breathe. We wouldn't have nearly as much joy in our lives. And I think that's sort of the reason why we're all here to begin with. So we have that in common, NYBG and Charles's foundation, love of historic landscape. We've done some managing of historic landscapes ourselves to make sure they're not eaten alive by invasives. We love trees. We love Calvert Vaux, right? We love a lot of the grand. We love Lyndon Miller. Thank you for being here. You know, we have a lot of people in common who cherish what we love. I'm a huge fan, and I think it's one of the great. Let's just say, coming from the Met, how Barbara introduced me, and that's feeling like my distant past, but it was only a few months ago. And one of the great dilemmas in culture, in any kind of history, whether it's landscape or art or music or dance, is making sure that anything that's new kind of resonates with old. Everything comes from a heritage, no matter how new and cutting edge it is, there's always something behind it. There's always something behind it. And then actually cherishing the old, making sure that even as we're developing new forms of craft and culture, art and landscape, that we never, ever, ever lose sight of beautiful historic features of our landscapes, our museums, of our culture. And I think that's what you do, but I'm looking forward to hearing more. Recent projects for Charles and his firm are Lincoln Road in Miami and Rio and Madrid. And as a preservationist, as a Chicagoan, I'm delighted to know that you're saving Jackson Park, which is one of the great, great, great landscapes of the historic Midwest. Or trying, you're laughing. And then Washington, D.C.'s Pershing Park. So again, just like NYBG is saving the plants of the world literally by sending people to the Amazon jungle and Mississippi where moss is being collected and moved to higher ground, I think what you're doing in the larger perspective of the landscape is really profound. So we're looking forward to hearing more from you. Welcome, Charles. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here, and you're right, everyone reads as a silhouette from up here. Before I actually begin, I just want to recognize several people. Some are in the room and some aren't. First, Susan Cohn, who has been recognized. Previously, I have been a fan of the series for many years. Susan has set the bar incredibly high, and candidly, I'm a little nervous tonight because unlike the other speakers, I'm not presenting my work, I'm presenting the work of others and ideas, and the people who I'm presenting their work are actually in the room, so there is a stress factor. But I also want to recognize two others who are in the room, Joan Shaffron and Barbara Dixon. Joan is our current board chairman, Barbara Dixon is our former chairman and is on our board, and without their leadership and their friendship, I couldn't be doing what I'm doing. I also want to give a little shout out to Suzanne Clary, who's come here from the Jay Heritage Center in Rye, who's a former board member and is the model of what if you want to use the term preservationist, what she has done at the Jay Heritage Center is extraordinary. And I also want to recognize a number of former TCLF employees and our first Sally Boasberg Fellow. Eddie, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Krakmaninoff. I'm not even close, am I, tonight? But, and then also Dina Tass-Winter and Barrett Dougherty. And then finally, the work of Raymond Jungles and the work of West 8, Daniel Vicini, the New York design director who worked alongside with Adrian for about a decade in Rotterdam. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being so generous with your resources so that I can come here this evening. Can I just ask quickly, how many people here have been to the website of the Cultural Landscape Foundation and know what we do? Oh, pretty good. So for those that don't know us, we are not a bricks and mortar organization. We live and breathe online. Our mission, quite simply, is connecting people to places. We have 3 primary programs. I won't really be talking about them this evening other than giving you little tastes. The first is Pioneers of American Landscape Design. We have over 900 profiles of people who have shaped the North American landscape on our website and 15 oral histories. We have over 2,100 sites in our What's Out There database, including the work of a number of people who are sitting in the room this evening. We've completed 15 city guides, and if you haven't looked at our New York City guide, check it out online. It's GPS enabled. You can pull out your iPhone and hit a button that says what's nearby, and every landscape within 25 miles will pop up for you. And then finally, we have a program called Landslide. I will talk about one of the sites that are on that list this evening, which is Jackson Park in Chicago, the site of the World's Columbian Exposition and the proposed location for the Obama Presidential Center. And finally, in the spirit of recognizing great women, I think this evening I'd also like to recognize Beatrix Ferrand, Ellen Shipman, and Marion Kruger-Coffin, who all contributed to NYBG, and the only other place in the US that can boast that is its neighbor, Woodlawn Cemetery. So to the great women that shaped this landscape and those that have enabled our efforts here, I thank you. A few words about what I'm going to do tonight. This is a new talk because, as I mentioned, Susan hoodwinked me into doing this. And so the first part, which is about 15 minutes, is sort of what is making me tick today and is going to provide a context for the work that I'm going to show you this evening. I'm going to veer away from project work because landscape architects are shaping cities. We're working in the public realm. It's not just trees and plants, but it's entire communities. And it's also, as the profession has always been going back to Olmsted, it's political. And it's something you hold in your hand. I'm hoping people will be posting on social media as I'm speaking this evening. But we have to be part of the forum, and we have to affect the way people instill value and engage with the resources that they move through. I'm then going to look at 5 portfolio projects. One is a personal favorite, which is a historical project, and then the other 2 are the works of the 2 firms that I previously mentioned. So with that, I ask you, why not cultural systems? Questions about the cultural value of the designed urban landscape have moved from intellectual arguments in scholarly journals to debates in city councils, on editorial pages, in the blogosphere, and elsewhere in the public realm, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, Fort Worth, Texas, Chicago, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., and here in New York City, among other places. Increasingly and incrementally, the cultural value of landscape architecture, including works from the recent past, are being reevaluated as the resurrection of the nation's urban centers continues. However, this reconsideration is still too often accompanied by a threat to a site's existence or design integrity. First, as we kick off the 2018 portfolio series here tonight, we might want to define the cultural value of landscape architecture, but that's tricky. Ask yourself how you define the cultural value of buildings, sculpture, and paintings, and then see how that criteria applies to landscape. We may have a common consensus about the cultural value of architecture and the allied arts, but we know they have value because we've learned they do. Perhaps it would be helpful for us to look at what gives something cultural value. And I would argue a core component of that is authenticity. This, of course, is the Frick collection. I chose this image because part of the authenticity here is the trompe-l'oeil, which was a device, in this case, employed by Russell Page with a 60-foot-long planter that was 5 foot wide, that is part of keeping that device alive as part of the Frick Garden rehabilitation restoration going forward. Now, take, for example, artwork by Frank Stella or Donald Judd. I guess you can't decide who I'm playing to tonight. It has value, cultural and monetary, because of its authenticity. Some people can pay more than $150 million to own a Picasso, while the rest of us can pay a relatively modest museum entrance fee to see one because of its authenticity and significance. In architectural terms, Mise's minimalist design for the Barcelona Pavilion, while Barragan's house and studio in the suburbs of Mexico City are viewed as authentic and therefore sacrosanct, while a minimalist landscape composition by Dan Kiley is viewed as expendable. I just took these photos a few months ago. You can see where there had been water features and they're now lawn panels. And this is the new marketing plan on the new garage, which says, "Live in art." This notion about realness is more than a hunch. A Smithsonian Museum survey identifying the real thing found that people want to see and experience the real thing. Only the real thing contains the evidence to support its symbolic and cultural importance. So if the public doesn't see it, how can they value it? We're in a transitional stage while the fundamental questions of cultural value are being raised and explored. a broadly held knowledge base for assessing its value is still developing, along with an understanding of the landscape architect's role. That's why New York's Ford Foundation Atrium and Madrid Rio in Spain, two projects we will explore in more detail, are so important in demonstrating how the successful melding of historic preservation and design can honor the significance of unique cultural assets and incorporate it into a thoroughly contemporary design. Nevertheless, even with the role of the landscape architect becoming more visible at places like the High Line, Chicago's Riverwalk, Los Angeles' Grand Park, and here in New York, Brooklyn Bridge Park, the understanding of what we do still lags behind, especially when it comes to the systems-based problem solving and planning that underpins the profession today. Broadly speaking, the public from an early age is hardwired to recognize the value of architecture and have a basic understanding of an architect's function. For example, if we asked a random sampling of people to define the qualities of a modern building, most, if not all, would be able to do so. When we asked to describe the qualities of a modern landscape, the outcome, sad to say, would likely be very different. Modern architecture has a perceived cultural value, while urban post-war modern landscapes are often treated as out of fashion, frequently ill-maintained, and usually viewed as empty space that needs to be filled or programmed. Reinforcing the idea is the fact that more than 1,000 structures listed on the National Register are less than 50 years of age, while only a handful of works of landscape architecture have been afforded such recognition. Moreover, urban landscapes are not read as a total and integrated design expression, but frequently as its constituent parts: paving trees, fountains, benches, sculpture furnishings. Imagine if our perception of architecture was the same, seeing buildings as doorknobs, staircases, and windows, rather than a design totality. A landscape architect's contribution is often thought of, to quote Tommy Church, parsley around the roast, while an architect's design is viewed as an artistic statement. Here's the bottom line. Recognizing, learning, and being sensitized to a landscape's cultural value and understanding the role of the landscape architect is critical to inform stewardship of our collective design landscape legacy. Given this current state of affairs, who's the target audience, and what's the role of communications for landscape architects? This is particularly important given our role in community-based meetings and not-for-profit neighborhood groups, where sometimes volatile debates about development, design, historic preservation, and planning breaks out. Among traditional print media, there are fewer full-time architecture critics, even more so with the recent departure of Christopher Hawthorne from the Los Angeles Times, and with some exceptions, they continue not to understand or don't make an effort to comprehend the role of landscape architecture and therefore treat it dismissively. Conversely, the proliferation of blogs, websites, and other new media outlets has increased the opportunity for cogently discussing and assessing the role, function, and import of landscape architecture and its practitioners. Unfortunately, several of the leading blogs and websites run the same stories, provide minimal critical insight that are object architecture-centric, an antediluvian balkanization of ideas that ignores the interconnectedness of design and historic preservation. Now, unfortunately, the compartmentalization or silo mentality that plays out in both academia and professional practice is not new. This is Norman Newton, Harvard professor, who taught there from 1939 and 1967, and if you didn't know it, he's talking about axial relationships in this photo, and is best known for the landscape architects in the room for the classic text, Design on the Land, which is still in print today. But a lot of people don't know the 1949 textbook he wrote, which is a gem called An Approach to Design, which contains the following cautionary observation in the chapter, Continuity in Design. Quote, "We live in a world of ever-increasing technical complexity. In order to get things done in such a world, we have arbitrarily segmented the whole continuous field of design into separate professions, within each of which there is the development of ability in certain particular techniques and special skills." Now, Newton was applying this to the schism between planning and landscape architecture but I will apply it this evening to the schism between historic preservation and landscape architecture. Newton continues later to say, the separation of professions in our schools of design carries on to our subsequent practice. For those of you that studied landscape architecture, think about every time that you were in one of those crits and that one person that always dressed in black and always got that A, and you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay then, maybe for the depth of content and for instilling values, we have to look to academia and the profession to provide leadership and to promote literacy and understanding. So, how well are they doing? While you marinate in those thoughts, let me provide some context on the profession's evolution. In 1969, so we're approaching the 50th anniversary, Ian McHarg published the seminal text, Design with Nature, in which he promoted an ecological approach to design, namely, design that goes hand in hand with hydrology, soil analysis, climate, and other factors. This was the era that introduced recycling, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the creation of the EPA, and many others. Scholars, the profession, lawmakers, and the general public were learning about a new mindset and its accompanying language, especially the utilitarian-sounding but fundamentally necessary environmental impact statement. We recognized then, and even more today, that we are no longer immune from what we did to the land and the impact we had on it. In Design with Nature, McHarg embraced urban America, noting in his introduction that every city has some testimony to perception, intelligence, and art. It's not the urban landscape, but the threat of sprawl that is motivating his call to action. In the chapter, A Response to Values, McHarg writes, so far we've been concerned to establish that natural phenomena are dynamic, interrelated processes, responsive to laws, and that these proffer opportunities and limitations to human use. But what about the land's capacity? We have McHarg to thank for opening our eyes to both evaluating and valuing nature when managing inevitable change in the metropolitan regions surrounding our cities. But how do we build on the foundations laid by Newton and McHarg in adopting planning, design, and historic preservation tools and regulations that integrate the unique and authentic cultural values embedded in our rapidly disappearing post-war legacy of urban landscape architecture infrastructure? As evidence of a shifting tide in the valuation of modern landscape architecture, in just the past few years, we've witnessed a number of major works added to the National Register. The Portland Chain of Open Spaces by Halpern, Hague's Gasworks Park, Greenacre Park by Sasaki, just recently designated here in New York, and Minneapolis's PV Plaza with Paul Friedberg, who's with us in the room this evening. Not to mention Fletcher Steele's Camden Amphitheater in Maine, the first use of a bent axis, America's first modernist landscape, 1928, was made a National Historic Landmark just 5 years ago. Building on these recent developments, is the time right to develop additional tools for evaluating and valuing our authentic modernist landscape heritage, going beyond designation and sustainable design solutions? If under US law, an environmental impact statement is required for certain actions that, quote, significantly affect the quality of the human environment, should cultural impact statements be in our future? Can design and preservation professionals make this part of the toolkit when it comes to public engagement, one that aims for sympathetic design and wise stewardship solutions? As mentioned earlier, public debates are occurring even when choices are cast as an either-or scenario, either preserve or raise and or replace. On occasion that is appropriate, usually, however, it is not. Nevertheless, what are landscape architects to do when the proverbial lines in the sand are drawn? The usual suspects queue up to take sides, and more reasoned conversation is trampled. How can we strike a balance between change and continuity? When do we destroy sufficient historic fabric to such an extent that we lose the authentic character-defining features that makes a work of landscape architecture distinct or significant? Tonight, let's set the stage with a reappraisal of one successful pioneering solution that has stood the test of time by straddling design and historic preservation. But before I do, indulge me for a moment. I'd like to just take a side visit, in contrast to the projects that we'll see, to look at 20 acres of Chicago's Jackson Park, an Olmsted and Box design that was part of their only park system outside of New York State, twice revised by the elder Olmsted. If you look at this image here, the red lines are the buildings from the Chicago Fair of 1893. So Olmsted was actually brought back in when the site was a charred ruin to put it back together. Patricia O'Donnell refers to this as America's first brownfield landscape, and it happened 70 years before Gasworks Park. It's listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It was designated in 1972, and 20 acres are currently proposed for the Obama Presidential Center. Note the word center. This is not a presidential library, though that's what people in Chicago originally thought they were getting. It's a privately operated facility to be built with private funds that will reportedly include meeting spaces, a museum, a basketball court, recording studios, a sledding hill, and other amenities. The Obama Presidential Center is being hosted by the University of Chicago, which beat out 3 other universities for the privilege. However, rather than construct the center on university-owned land, which its competitors proposed, the University of Chicago demanded parkland on the city's south side, held in public trust for some 150 years. Could you imagine if Columbia University in New York City had demanded 20 acres of Central Park as part of their bid? Remarkably, the mayor, the city council, and other municipal agencies all supported this confiscation. What's particularly galling is that the University of Chicago has significant land holdings throughout the South Side, and there's available vacant land that the city owns that could be used. The university has been actively buying up land in the area and stands to profit handsomely through real estate development. This is a fraught situation involving a popular ex-president and a section of Chicago that badly needs an economic boost. Moreover, supporters of the center say its presence on the South Side is the area's, quote, last best chance at economic revitalization. TCLF does not oppose siting the center on the South Side, but we are opposed to the confiscation of parkland for the purpose and have advocated as such for 3 years. We believe this precedent gives municipalities throughout the nation a green light to pursue similar actions on behalf of private institutions. I ask all of you, do you support the taking of historic parkland, let alone land designed by Olmsted and Box, for 9 acres of building architecture? There is not only opposition to parkland confiscation, strong concerns and fears are being expressed by long-term residents that they'll be priced out of the neighborhood. However, their demand for a community benefits agreement, which offers some protection against displacement, have been met with opposition from the former president and his foundation. For the university, this is all reward and no risk. As you contemplate the projects that follow in the portfolio series, as the OPC illustrates, managing change when it comes to cultural systems and lifeways is just as complex and essential as natural systems and ecology. So with that as a prelude, and now that I've just given you some medicine, what I'd like to do now is reward you for taking the medicine. And this is the layer cake, but it's also, and every landscape is nuanced and layered. And I'm always intrigued when I look at a place like NYBG and you think about the trees and the topography. And yet this is a landscape that has an unrivaled pedigree of authors. And it's actually seamless. And I don't have time to go into this evening, but I wanted to just give you a flavor. And this is the work that was done in the Cultural Landscape Report for the garden by Patricia O'Donnell. Calvert Vaux was mentioned earlier. Vaux and Parsons did the initial plan. But what is astonishing here is that, and this is a theme for tonight, is there is a common symphonic language and a shared value system that both the landscape architects and the patrons brought to the garden over more than a century. I mentioned earlier the pedigree of the three great women of the country place era, the tenure of the Olmsted brothers, and Gilmore Clark and Michael Rapuano's practice as well. There really is no place like this, not just as a botanical garden, but as a work of landscape architecture in America that has such pedigree. And the question for the stewards is, so what does that mean? And how does that affect the framework for what happens there? So with that, I'm now going to do the work I'm supposed to do, which is, this is my portfolio. It's not my work, but it's work that inspires me. I said I'd have one vintage project, and because I'm making a surgical reference, I thought I would show a scene from Dr. Kildare. But this is Society Hill in Philadelphia. And I've been going to Society Hill now for several decades, and it's remarkable to see how this project has stood the test of time. Named for the Free Society of Traders who owned the land in 1682, the market had fallen on some tough times, like a lot of cities. By the 50s, the outdated market was relocated, allowing the city's planning commission to begin the Washington Square East Urban Renewal Project in 1957. What you see here is Le Corbusier's towers in the park. This is a wonderful drawing that shows City Planning Director Ed Bacon's vision to preserve and restore significant historic fabric in tandem with removing the blighted or incompatible structures, replacing them with modern buildings and open spaces that integrated with the neighborhood's historic context. This is revolutionary thinking. Here are the towers. We see how they can step down to the 3-story residential to meet the Regency-style architecture of the neighborhood. John Collins, who knit all of this embroidery together, designed the landscape, including some of the parks. This is Delancey Park, now Three Bears Park. The parks are, on their own, the most modern in appearance, as you could see here. But when you step out into the landscape, here are Collins' landscape details: richly patterned brick sidewalks and walls, granite curbs and backless benches, alleys, street trees, site-specific light standards and bollards, combined with small courtyards and pocket parks peppered throughout 120 acres. The results, a cohesive and symphonic blend of site-specific historic and modern buildings and landscape features. I think these images speak for themselves. The Central Market. I don't know of another project. Run your eye across the buildings on the left-hand side where everything reads together, and you've got Pei and Gurgala and other architects that are now part of this larger palimpsest of layered design history. This was recently produced on NPR in Philadelphia. What happened in Society Hill, in our experience, and I speak only from that, was not displacement, says Harry Schwartz, who moved in about a decade after city government spurred the redevelopment of the neighborhood, but rather reoccupation and restoration. Society Hill's transformation from one of the city's poorest neighborhoods in the 1950s to one of the richest by 1970 appears in textbooks today as a model of urban renewal, but in its time, the neighborhood's rebirth was an isolated instance amid a prolonged and widespread exodus of wealthier, usually white residents from city centers across the US. For the landscape architects that are in the room that are going to Philadelphia for the annual meeting, I encourage you to revisit Society Hill when you're there this year. This really is a beautiful work of infill where there is a shared language that has stood the test of time. So now for a more contemporary operating room. And I'd like to take us to 2 projects by Raymond Jungels. The first is Lincoln Road Mall in Miami. First mapped in 1912, designed by Carl Fisher in 1914, Lincoln Road has served as a social center for the city of Miami. If you've been there, I'm sure you know it. It runs east to west between 16th and 17th Streets. 6 blocks of the road were closed to vehicles and converted to a pedestrian mall in 1960. Now remember, there were over 200 pedestrian malls created in the US around this time. You can count on one hand those that survived that were successful and viable today. Designed by hotel architect Morris Lapidus. My favorite is the Lapidus quote, "I designed Lincoln Road for people, a car never bought anything." And here again, as we saw with Collins' work in Society Hill, there is a symphonic and limited palette of site furnishings and plant materials. Just a couple of visuals. of the Lapidus design. In the 1980s, plantings and hardscapes slowly deteriorated. The area was having some piecemeal revitalization in the 90s. In 1997, Martha Schwartz replanted native palms and renovated fountains that had fallen into disrepair. The challenge with this block, as you could see here, it was very difficult to penetrate physically, visually. If you were a shop merchant, it was hard to see your signs. The block was not a success. More recently, we can see here also how the pedestrian spaces have been adopted by cafes and restaurants. And then moving west in 2010, an additional block was added to the mall designed by Raymond Jungels. Now, for those of you that don't know Raymond Jungels, I believe more than 2 decades with Roberto Burle Marx, but I show this because for me, this is this project. If you look at Raymond's work, it is part Burle Marx, it's part Halpern choreography, part Lapidus equals Raymond Jungels. Conceived as a water garden with kidney shapes and biomorphic forms, Jungels' plan uses biofiltration, native plants, and eye-catching materials to create an urban oasis on the pedestrian mall. It's this simple: water gardens, stone paving, benches, a performance stage, interactive glass pavilion by Dan Graham, retail, pedestrian connections. That's it. In all the projects, to me, that I'm looking at this evening, what I was really struck by was this balancing and putting on equal platforms art and science, and nature and culture. I think these images speak for themselves. I don't want to say a lot, but you can see the simplicity, the shared language. Not Lapidus, but a very happy next-door neighbor. For those of you that know the Ford Foundation, you may know that it's been closed for a while. We get, it's funny, if you Google the Ford Foundation atrium, we come up often #1 in a Google search. So every week we get phone calls and emails about fashion shoots and weddings that want to be there, and we just give them the phone number for the Ford Foundation who to call. But so we have to keep abreast of when they're opening because we get calls all the time. This is an interesting project because unlike the other project that I just showed you, if you were to try to channel Raymond Jungels, you would start with Dan Kiley, and then you would have this guy who probably most people don't know. This is Joe Carr, who was in Kiley's office. And then I have to put in Sherlock Holmes because, and this is Raymond when we had a foundation trip to Japan together, and it's just a hell of a fun photograph that I wanted to show it. But what's remarkable here is the sleuthing that went into the plant material selections. The Ford Foundation, an atrium, 1967, a masterpiece of modernism by Roach Dinkeloo and Dan Kiley. This is this person I just mentioned, Joe Carr. Joe had a great number of projects in the 60s in Dan's office, and in particular the Ford Foundation and the Oakland Museum, where he worked with Geraldine Knight Scott, the California landscape architect and plantswoman, and Jerry also provided some advice to Joe on the Ford Foundation as well. Here's Joe in an animated phase. And I don't know if you've ever seen these photographs, Raymond. These were sent to me by Joe. I'm guessing his wife took these when Raymond paid a visit to Joe to understand the plant history of the Ford Foundation. The building's exterior is largely composed of glass panels, Corten steel, brown pink granite with the south and east facades enclosed in glass, 12 stories of office space. The glass walls create a temperate environment that is ideal for the atrium's subtropical garden, while also creating a seamless flow of green space between the city and the interior atrium. Kiley's landscape design, installed on the ground floor of the 160-foot tall atrium, is driven by the 13-foot grade change between 42nd and 43rd Streets. I showed these images earlier to give a sense of how this has changed over time. The terraces step down to the garden's focal point, a square still water pool edged with a wide concrete band that sits at the atrium's lowest level. The terraces were originally planted with 12 saucer magnolias, this is indoors, low shrubs and ground covers, which were later replaced with a variety of lush subtropical plants better suited for the interior environment. Now, I wanted to just give you a flavor of some of the work that Raymond has done here, and look at the design intent on the top right. Remain as true to Dan Kiley's design as possible. Provide a maximum reflective surface. This is now about the water feature. Provide a pleasant sound, and determine feasibility of aquatic plants. Again, art and science, understanding Kiley's design intent and the reality in terms of the context for sun's shade studies. Here, for example, is a study of the original Magnolia grandiflora that I mentioned. Here they are with the ficus Amstel King, the Amstel King ficus, which was the proposed replacement. And you can see here the detailed study of both science and art, art being the color, scale, form, and texture of the plant material. And uncovering the plants. And on this project, they are quite detailed. These are the trees. You can see here the canopy overlay analysis. So we have design intent. We see the big disconnect with what was the existing conditions, and then a plan for renewal. And here it is succinctly from Raymond's office. Our approach is driven by deliberate planting relationships, meaningfully executed to grow stronger with time, leveraging Kiley's inherent design vision with scientific innovation and careful study of the garden's evolution over time. Now, I don't know about you people, but that's like a too-hanky moment for me. That to me is just, what more can you ask for? I mean, that's a beautiful thing. A temperate aesthetic will believe a subtropical palette more aptly suited to the indoor environment, reconciling the learning curve encountered by Kiley and simultaneously blurring the boundary between the atrium and the city with renewed strength. Texture, volume, color, light, and fragrance will be meticulously orchestrated to respect and honor the space. I wish I had an hour just to talk about this project, but just to give you a sense of the level of analysis for every plant, from canopy to understory to ground cover. It's astonishing. This is a Valentine to Kiley's work and to revisiting the foundation, the Ford Foundation today, through a passionate commitment, not just to design and historic preservation, but someone who truly loves plants. And Kiley would see this, and this is about the architecture of plants. So it's all here. Joe Carr, the design was as much about the space as about the plant types. I encourage people to talk to Raymond about the project afterwards. But one of the things that's always interesting to me when I think of my heroes, they're Laurie Olin, they're Lawrence Halprin. And for me, there are many reasons why. But for me, one of the great things about their work is there is a transparency in their thought process, in their writing, in their drawing. We understand their design intent, and they make it easy for us because there's such clarity in the vision. And this project embodies that. I'm going to keep moving because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time. So let's take a little trip from New York to Rotterdam. I'm not sure if Alexandra Lang is here this evening, but if you haven't read her piece about Adrian and Westgate in The New Yorker from May 16th, Google it. In this, there's a reflection from Adrian. Olmsted manipulated the perspective in a way that Americans have the illusion of the wilderness. Park history is related to illusions and is not far from the realm of poetry and painting. We work from a certain narrative, anecdote, or feeling. There are other components, functionality, durability, a timeless component, but illusion is where it starts. He goes on, we wanted to manipulate the eye to create suspense, so you have a craving to see this statue. and then you see her. It's the ultimate seduction. But first, Madrid, Rio. So I didn't get to talk to Adrian about who his modern masters were, but I'm going to put William Dudek here, who was a very influential Dutch modernist architect. And here, too, we see Olmsted and Halprin, because there is a lot of choreography here in Madrid. In 2003, the Madrid Council committed to building a tunnel for a stretch of the main ring road around the city. When it was constructed 30 years ago, the road severed the physical connections between the city and the river. As a result of the construction of these tunnels, an enormous opportunity to expand the public realm and knit back together myriad neighborhoods opened up smack in the heart of Madrid. This just gives you a sense of the scar that was this road for 9 miles. The most important project executed in Madrid over the last few decades, and I would go on to say probably one of the most ambitious carried out in Europe in recent times. This is a pioneering effort aiming to follow a new approach of integrating large infrastructure and the built fabric of cities within the natural and cultural contexts, resulting in a place in which the landscape, the city, the architecture, and the urban infrastructure combine to greater environmental biodiversity and a city that is greener, more habitable, and sustainable. This gives you a sense of some of the patrimony that exists within this 9-mile corridor. Just as a point of reference, on the left, this had been a vehicular bridge. It isn't anymore. It's been given over to pedestrians. On top of this huge underground construction, vegetation was used as the main material, constructing a dense and ecologically rich plant structure to create an artificial living landscape on an inert underground substrate. Almost half of the project's surface area is on top of tunnels, and the complicated technical facilities associated with these and large urban infrastructures. There are 4 character areas, and I'll just give you a flavor of each of those right now. First, the Salon de Pinos. It's a linear green space which links the existing and newly designed urban space. This is definitely the Halprin piece, the choreography of 8,000 pine trees. And here you can see, I think all of Europe, they cleaned them out. The second is the Avenida de Portugal. This was, believe it or not, a road. By relocating one of the most important roads into the center of Madrid underground and providing parking for 1,000 vehicles, it was possible to convert the space into a public garden to benefit local residents. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the undertaking, the cherry blossom, the work underway, it's incredible to see this today. It is a real center of energy. Huerta de la Pardida, the old royal palace, is now a modern interpretation of the original 16th century royal orchard with a wide variety of fruit trees planted in groups to create an enclosed garden. Here, the dominant design tool is water with a system of streams running through the park that cross through topographic features and merge into varied nodal spaces. Ancient olives. And then finally, Puentes Cascada. Here, bridges and iconic landmarks create a place where connection with the river is enhanced. Designed as a massive concrete dome, the bridges feature more than 100 cables resembling whale balloons, which are fixed to the slim steel deck. The fine detailing becomes visible when entering the bridge, and the ceilings are adorned with a mosaic artwork done by Spanish artist Daniel Canoger. These are also local people in the community who are depicted. And again, art and science. Even the act of the tree planting and the tree stewardship is made visible in an artful way to give dignity to the work. Finally, and this is actually a Busby Berkeley musical, Ariel, it seemed an appropriate way to conclude with Governor's Island. And here we have Olmsted, Busby Berkeley, and this next one is actually suggested to me by Adrian when I saw him a couple of weeks ago. Max Factor, you ask? Adrian. And here is the Max Factor piece. It's all the eyeliner that goes on all of the edging of all of the plantings. These drawings have been done by the Friends of Governor's Island, and I couldn't resist sharing them this evening because they really tell the story. I love the idea of this sort of ice cream cone, egg-shaped rock at the top, which was the early island. 1911, the addition of the South Island. 96, the end of the military occupation. 2003, becoming a public landscape. 22 acres of a national park to be managed by the NPS. And then in subsequent years, the Trust for Governor's Island was charged with stewardship and redevelopment of the remaining 150 acres. 2014, phase 1. Excuse me. I wanted to show this image as I take a sip of water. What was intriguing to me in looking at Governor's Island and Lincoln Road, although the scale is different, they are the same, in that we have an area that has a very high concentration of historic resources, and then an area that has carrying capacity. Excuse me one second, I'm sorry. I get very choked up when I look at West State's work. But it says a lot about understanding, excuse me, understanding how a landscape can adapt. And there are areas that one has to be surgical, and there are areas where they can be much more whimsical and free and open. And here's the plan. I was intrigued to see how many people saw the article in the New York Times in the last 24 hours about Governor's Island. A few. And it was interesting to me to somehow read this article and think that development was always part of this. And it was part of the scheme. So perhaps a topic for future conversation after this presentation. But let's look at the design. First, the transformation through topography. And in the tradition of Central and Prospect Parks, the plan dramatically sculpts the flat utilitarian south part of the island. The park experience is enhanced through its undulating ground plane, frame views and enclosures, all of which convey a sense of drama. New topography curves and weaves, providing small high points while making the experience of the heart of the island seem vast, while providing opportunities for exploration and discovery. Can I just ask, how many people have been to Governor's Island here? Wow, that's awesome. Did you guys do a field trip at NYBG or something? It's like everyone raised their hands. Daniel, this is awesome. But, you know, for me, what was just remarkable is I don't know really since Olmsted if I'd experienced such a scenographic landscape. And you can see this diagram here where you really understand the views that are being afforded here that we've never seen as New Yorkers before, these kinds of panoramas. There was a piece in The Atlantic in 2016 by Nathaniel Rich. He noted, Olmsted's first principle was that a park should complement the city to which it belongs. If a city is cramped, crowded, and rectilinear, its parks should be composed of sinuous thoroughfares and a variable topography that includes large open spaces. The comparative largeness of Central Park was essential, since a park should be a ground which invites, encourages, and facilitates movement. The giddy impulse you feel upon arriving at the Great Lawn or the Sheep Meadow to burst into a full-out spirit. That is by design. You could say the same about Governor's Island a century plus later. And to look at these images, I for one find myself thinking about the stereoscopic views I've seen of the land sculpting of Central Park, but on a much greater scale. Again, art and science, nature and culture. 2, the Green Island. The master plan calls for the island to be a green skyline in the harbor. Redundant hardscape associated with vehicles and parking was removed, while new lawns, gardens, wetlands, and groves are introduced. More than 1,300 new trees were planted, adding to the 1,700 already on site. Plant selection focused on native and locally adapted species with sensitivity to regional shifts in weather patterns. Intrinsic to this stewardship strategy are regenerative strategies for managing stormwater, recycling, and park longevity. 3, an island like no other. Governor's Island is truly an island like no other with a unique vantage point on the harbor. The master plan provides myriad spaces to reveal in the sensual experiences of water and sky, in addition to providing enclosure, refuge, and escape within the heart of the island. The design offers, as I mentioned, 2 360-degree experiences, one slowly unfolding for the visitor while the other provides surprise and drama as the visitor ascends to the summit of the hills. The design reinforces the location of the island in the design of the park-wide custom details. For example, paving patterns convey an abstraction of aquatic forms. Furnishings such as bicycle seating and the balustrade provide opportunities to experience the harbor in different ways. As with Philadelphia Society Hill and Lincoln Road, this customized narrative provides a richness of ornamentation that highlights the landscape experience and celebrates this landscape tradition. And then finally, a carefree island. The island embodies a carefree spirit. So in closing, as illustrated by these personal portfolio series case studies, we can see that landscape architecture practice historically by John Collins in Philadelphia, and most recently by Raymond Jungels in Westgate, illustrate and validate that we are in fact in an era of urban re-renewal where our urban infrastructure in all of its rich, glorious, and at times messy manifestations lays dormant and often invisible. Recognizing that these extant yet often diminished works of landscape architecture have the potential to serve as connective tissue in our shared cultural narrative, aptly builds upon Newton's quest to eliminate segmentation in teaching and practice, while expanding upon McHarg's valuation beyond merely ecological systems to something orchestrated or conducted by landscape architects that can result in something truly symphonic. Finally, I'm pleased to conclude with one last image. This is the work of Reed Hildebrand and Nelson Bird-Woltz, whose work will follow with the next talk in the portfolio series. And like the work by Jungels and Westgate, these firms embody a holistic design and stewardship approach. In closing, I hope that you will concur that the work that I've presented this evening seizes the opportunity to teach people how to see and value the landscape that we move through every day. Here, leveraging a comprehensive systems-based planning process that embraces a shared narrative and the unique cultural expression embedded within our shared, irreplaceable urban fabric. Abstaining from or abdicating from that responsibility will most certainly lead to less site-specific design solutions and the additional homogenization of our urban core. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to thank Charles for this amazing lecture. I'm completely convinced of the cultural meaning of landscape architecture. Completely convinced. I think if we'd have to get you to give that very political lecture again and again and again, many, many places, to audiences that don't know that already or that weren't thinking about it quite as hard. So thank you, Charles. I know Charles has agreed to stand up here and answer some questions for those of you who want to come forward, but enjoy, the rest of you. Visit a garden or a park near you soon. Thank you.